Human rescued an alien girl from the sliding ravine. Her calm gratitude reached somewhere deeper. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, back to the main character. James Carter was trekking through the mountain pass, his boots crunching on the frozen ground with each step. The winds howled through the narrow ravine, biting at his exposed face. The storm had come out of nowhere, turning what should have been a peaceful hike into a battle against nature itself. He glanced around, trying to make out the path through the blizzard, but the snow was falling so thickly that visibility was down to mere feet. He had come out here looking for a shortcut back to the base camp, but now, as the temperature dropped rapidly, he was beginning to regret that decision. The wind whipped his face, stinging his skin, and his breath came in sharp clouds of vapor, quickly freezing in the air. As he pushed forward, a sudden noise pierced the air, a cry, barely audible above the wind. It was faint, but unmistakable. A call for help. James's heart raced as he spun toward the sound, his eyes scanning the wide-out conditions. There, through the blur of snow, he spotted a figure, a person struggling near the edge of the ravine. Without thinking, James bolted toward them, his legs moving with urgency despite the deep snow that tried to hold him back. As he reached the edge of the ravine, he saw her, an alien girl, her body covered in light, shimmering armor that gleamed even in the snowstorm. She was caught, teetering on the edge, struggling to keep her balance as the snow slid beneath her feet. James didn't hesitate. With a quick motion, he grabbed her wrist and pulled her toward him, barely managing to stop her from sliding further into the ravine. Her eyes were wide with panic, but they softened as she looked at him, a glimmer of understanding passing between them. I can't stay here, she gasped, her voice trembling. With fear, James didn't say anything. Instead, he hauled her back to safety, his muscles straining with the effort. He managed to find a sheltered area a few feet away from the edge, where the wind was less fierce. The girl, still in shock, sank down onto the ground, her breath coming in shallow gasps. James, trying to steady his own breath, knelt beside her. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft but urgent. She nodded slowly, her violet-colored skin shimmering faintly under the storm's light. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice carrying a calm that belied the fear in her eyes. "You saved my life." James smiled, though it was more out of instinct than anything else. He had been trained to save lives, but there was something about her calm gratitude that hit him harder than any of his previous rescues. "I couldn't just leave you," he said simply. "We'll wait here until the storm lets up." The girl looked up at him, her eyes searching his face, as if weighing his words. Her calmness, in the face of such a dire situation, was striking. It was as though she had known all along that someone would come to help her. "You're different from what I've been told," she said after a long moment, her voice soft yet sincere. James raised an eyebrow, but before he could ask what she meant, she continued. "Most of your kind, they would not have bothered. But you stayed. You didn't hesitate." He looked down at her, taken aback by her words. "I'm just doing what anyone would do," he replied, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. But the girl just shook her head slightly, a small, knowing smile playing at the corners of her lips. "No, not everyone would. Not in my world." James sat down beside her, his back against the cold rock, looking out at the storm. The wind had died down, but the snow continued to fall heavily. He wasn't sure how long they would have to wait, but for now, he was content to stay. The girl, who had once seemed so distant and unreachable, was now someone he had connected with on a level that felt deeper than just saving her life. There was a bond there, one forged in the cold, the storm, and the unspoken understanding that neither of them had been entirely prepared for. And as the storm raged on, they sat together, waiting for the world to calm, knowing that somehow, their paths had crossed for a reason. James sat quietly beside Lyra, his mind drifting as he watched the snow slowly begin to settle. The storm had passed, but the cold still bit at the air, and the isolation of the mountain pass seemed almost overwhelming. He had no idea how long they would be stranded there, but he had learned a long time ago to never underestimate the power of nature. Lyra, however, remained calm, her silver eyes focused on the horizon, where the last remnants of the storm clouds were disappearing into the distance. It was almost as if she had expected this. James shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what to say. He had saved her, but the weight of her gratitude felt heavier than the snow that had almost buried them both. It wasn't just that she was grateful. It was the depth of that gratitude, the way she seemed to carry it with an unspoken understanding that made James feel like he was part of something far bigger than just a rescue mission. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them wasn't awkward, but it was laden with something deeper. James finally broke the quiet. "So what now?" he asked, his voice steady. But there was an undercurrent of uncertainty. Lyra turned her gaze to him, her lips curling into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Now we wait," she replied, her voice soft yet firm. "There's no need to rush." James nodded, trying to read her expression, but she was impossible to read. Her calm demeanor made it feel as though she had lived through far worse situations and was just passing the time until the next one arrived. He wasn't sure how to feel about that. He had spent his life training for emergencies, but what Lyra displayed was a kind of quiet strength that James could not have prepared for. He had assumed that she, like any other person, would show fear in the face of danger. But she had shown none. As they sat together, James noticed small details about her that he hadn't observed before. Her violet skin, the way her silvery hair shimmered slightly in the fading light, the way her movements seemed so purposeful, even when she did nothing at all. It wasn't just her physical appearance that intrigued him, though. It was the way she held herself, as if every action, every word, was carefully chosen. She wasn't just a survivor of the storm. She was something more, something otherworldly in a way that James couldn't quite grasp. Finally, he couldn't hold back the question any longer. "Where are you from?" he asked. Lyra's expression didn't change, but her gaze softened as she looked at him. "I'm from a place far away," she said simply, her voice carrying a weight that made James feel like he was only scratching the surface. "A place where people do not need to fear the storm." James studied her for a long moment, sensing that there was much more to her than what she was willing to reveal. But he didn't press her further. Instead, he focused on the here and now, their survival. "What about your people?" he asked. "Are they looking for you?" Lyra's lips parted slightly, but she didn't answer immediately. It was clear that the question had struck a nerve. James regretted asking it, but before he could apologize, Lyra spoke. "They are not the ones I'm worried about," she said quietly, her voice almost lost in the wind. "It's you." James blinked in surprise, unsure if he had heard her correctly. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Lyra turned to face him fully, her gaze intense and piercing. "You risked your life for me," she said simply. "That is not something I take lightly." James felt the weight of her words settle deep within him. He had done what anyone would have done, but to Lyra, it seemed like something far more significant. "It's just what people do," James said, unsure of how else to explain it. But Lyra shook her head slowly. "No, James," she said softly, her voice steady but with an edge of finality. "It is what you did that makes you different." The silence that followed was profound. James felt a warmth spread through him despite the chill in the air. It wasn't just gratitude that he had seen in her eyes. It was a recognition of something deeper, something more human. He could feel that recognition in the air between them, like a bridge being built slowly but surely, a connection that neither of them had anticipated. They didn't need to speak any further. The truth of her words had settled between them, and in that moment, James realized that the storm had not only brought them together physically, but had opened something deeper, something neither of them had expected. Lyra, a being from another world, had seen something in him that he hadn't quite understood about himself. And that realization, small as it seemed, was enough to make him feel like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone in this vast universe as he had once thought. James and Lyra spent the next few hours in relative silence, the world around them wrapped in a soft, white stillness. The storm had cleared, leaving behind a peaceful quiet that seemed almost unnatural in its intensity. James was the first to break the silence, shifting on the cold stone beneath him. He looked over at Lyra, who was gazing out into the snowy expanse, her eyes distant yet calm. "Do you ever get used to this?" James asked, his voice breaking through the quiet like a ripple on a still pond. Lyra turned her head slightly, a faint glimmer of amusement in her eyes. "Get used to what?" she replied, her voice low but clear. "The cold," James said, gesturing around them at the snow-covered landscape. "I don't think I'll ever really get used to it." Lyra's gaze softened as she studied him. "The cold is not the worst thing you'll face," she said quietly, her words carrying a weight that James couldn't fully understand. He frowned, intrigued but unwilling to pry further. Instead, he let the moment pass, focusing on their immediate surroundings. They were still far from civilization, but James knew that with the storm over, it was only a matter of time before someone would come looking for them. His thoughts wandered to the conversation they had started earlier, the one about her people, about where she was from. But before he could ask more, Lyra spoke again. "You ask about my people," she began, her voice carrying a note of sadness. "But my world is not what you might imagine." James turned to face her, his curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" Lyra took a deep breath, her fingers gently brushing the snow at her side. "I come from a place where survival is not guaranteed," she continued, her voice steady despite the emotion. In her eyes, a place where trust is rare and people often do not survive long enough to form lasting bonds. The strong survive, and the weak are cast aside. James listened intently, the weight of her words settling in his chest. It was a stark contrast to the world he knew, where survival wasn't always about strength, but about community, about helping others when they needed it most. "And you," Lyra said, her voice softening, "you saved me." Without a second thought. "I never expected someone from your world to act with such kindness." James looked at her, the question he had been dying to ask finally slipping from his lips. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you think that?" Lyra met his gaze, her eyes searching his face as if looking for something that only she could understand. "Because of what I've seen," she said, her voice almost wistful. "I've seen many of your kind. Most act out of self-interest, driven by the need to survive. But you—" She paused, her lips parting as if she struggled to find the right words. "You acted out of something deeper." James felt the weight of her gaze on him, and for the first time since they had met, he felt exposed. He wasn't sure why he had acted the way he did. It was second nature to help someone in need, to do what he could to make sure they survived. But something about Lyra, something about the way she had carried herself through the storm, had made him want to protect her. "I didn't think about it," James said, his voice steady, though a twinge of uncertainty crept into his words. "I just saw you there, and I knew I had to help. It wasn't really a choice." Lyra studied him for a long time, her expression unreadable. Then, without warning, she smiled. It was a small, genuine smile that softened her features and made her appear almost human. "Maybe that's what makes you different," she said softly. "You didn't hesitate." The silence between them deepened, but this time, it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a quiet understanding, a mutual recognition that their worlds, though vastly different, had intersected in this strange, unexpected moment. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, casting the world in a warm, golden light, James felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. He was no longer alone, and neither was she. For now, they were two strangers bound by a shared experience, a moment of kindness that had sparked something deeper than either of them had anticipated. And for the first time in a long while, James felt that perhaps, just perhaps, he had done something that truly mattered. As the evening wore on, the cold grew sharper, but the fire James had started kept them warm enough in their small shelter beneath the overhang. The wind had died down completely, and the world around them had become eerily quiet, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. James sat cross-legged, his jacket pulled tightly around him, trying to conserve as much heat as he could. He glanced over at Lyra, who was sitting on the other side of the fire, her eyes closed in quiet contemplation. She seemed at peace in the stillness, as if this was not her first time enduring the harsh wilderness. James couldn't help but admire her calm demeanor. It was something he didn't fully understand. After all, she was a stranger to this world, yet she appeared more at home in this desolate place than he ever could. Lyra opened her eyes and met his gaze. Her violet eyes held a depth to them that made James feel as though she could see right through him. She said nothing, but the quiet exchange between them was enough. James shifted uncomfortably. "You're not like most people I've met," he said quietly, his voice breaking the silence. Lyra raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "How so?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. James hesitated, trying to find the right words. I just mean, you don't seem afraid of anything," he said. "Not the storm, not the cold. It's like you're used to it, like it doesn't bother you at all." Lyra's lips curled into a small smile. "Fear is an interesting thing," she said, her voice thoughtful. "It can be paralyzing, yes, but it can also be a source of strength if you know how to use it." James frowned. "What do you mean by that?" he asked. Lyra tilted her head slightly, her eyes distant for a moment. "Where I come from, survival is everything," she said, her voice quiet, almost as if she were speaking more to herself than to James. "And survival is not just about physical strength. It's about controlling your fear, using it to stay alert, to think clearly when everything around you is chaos." James listened carefully. There was a weight to her words, a truth that resonated with him. He had always thought of fear as something to avoid, something to overcome. But Lyra was showing him a different perspective. "It's not easy," Lyra continued, her eyes meeting his once more. "But it's how we survive." James nodded slowly, taking in her words. There was something about the way she spoke, the way she carried herself, that made him believe every word she said. It was as though she had lived through countless storms, both literal and metaphorical, and had come out stronger on the other side. He admired that strength. He had always prided himself on his training, his ability to handle whatever was thrown at him. But Lyra's calm in the face of danger, her ability to remain composed when everything around her was falling apart, made him realize just how much he still had to learn. He couldn't imagine living in a world like hers, where survival was a constant struggle, where trust was a luxury few could afford. But it was clear to him now that Lyra was not just surviving, she was thriving. He shifted again, drawing his knees to his chest to conserve warmth. "I don't think I could do it," he admitted quietly, his voice tinged with vulnerability. "I don't know how you do it, how you stay so calm." Lyra studied him for a moment before speaking. "You don't have to do it alone," she said softly. "Sometimes, it's not about being strong all the time. It's about knowing when to lean on someone else, when to trust that you don't have to carry the weight on your own." James looked at her, surprised by her words. There was something almost reassuring in them, something that made him feel less alone in this vast, unfamiliar world. He had always been the one to protect others, to carry the burden for those who couldn't. But for the first time, he realized that maybe, just maybe, it was okay to lean on someone else too. The silence between them deepened, but it was no longer uncomfortable. It was a shared silence, one that spoke of understanding, of mutual respect. James felt the weight of the day slowly lift from his shoulders. He wasn't sure how much longer they would be stuck here, but for now, he was content to sit in the quiet company of someone who, despite being so different, seemed to understand him in a way few ever had. As the fire crackled between them, James realized that this strange, unexpected connection was something he would not soon forget. The mountains, the storm, the cold, it all seemed distant now, almost insignificant compared to the bond that was beginning to form between them. The morning sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft, golden light over the snow-covered mountains. The world felt still, almost frozen in time, as if nature itself had paused to take a breath. James stirred, the cold biting at his skin as he woke, but the warmth from the fire they had shared the night before still lingered in his bones. He looked over at Lyra, who was already awake, sitting quietly with her eyes closed as she absorbed the calmness of the morning. Her presence was so peaceful, so serene, that it was hard to believe she had only just survived a perilous ordeal. She was different from anyone James had ever met, not just in the way she looked, but in the way she moved, in the way she carried herself. There was a quiet strength to her that James found both awe-inspiring and comforting. It wasn't just her survival instincts that impressed him. It was the way she approached everything, with patience, with grace, and with a wisdom that seemed beyond her years. He couldn't help but wonder what it was like, living in a world where trust was a rare commodity, where survival depended on more than just brute strength. He had never had to fight for survival like she had, at least not in the same way. His challenges had always been more about duty, responsibility, and keeping others safe. He watched as Lyra opened her eyes and turned her gaze toward him. She didn't speak at first, but her look said everything. She had seen him studying her, and she seemed unbothered by it. Instead, she gave him a small smile. "Ready to move on?" she asked, her voice calm, as if they weren't stranded in the middle of nowhere. James nodded slowly, though he wasn't entirely sure how to approach the journey ahead. "I think so," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. He wasn't afraid of the mountains or the wilderness. What worried him was the unknown. What lay beyond the next ridge? How far would they need to go before they found help? "You're not worried?" he asked, his voice betraying a hint of uncertainty. Lyra tilted her head slightly, her violet eyes narrowing in thought. "Worry is not something that will help us here," she said softly, almost as if speaking to herself more than to him. "I've learned that when you focus too much on the things you cannot control, you lose sight of the things you can." James felt her words sink in. It was something he had struggled with his whole life, trying to control everything around him, trying to ensure that things went the way they were supposed to. But Lyra's calm demeanor was starting to rub off on him. Maybe it wasn't about control. Maybe it was about adaptation, about being present in the moment. "I guess that makes sense," he said, more to himself than to her. Lyra gave him a slight nod. "It's not always easy," she admitted. "But it's how we survive." There was that word again, survive. James had always thought of it as something that just happened. You kept going, kept moving forward, no matter what. But Lyra made it sound different. She made it sound purposeful, like survival wasn't just about existing, but about making the best of whatever situation you found yourself in. He had seen glimpses of that in her last night, when she had trusted him without question, when she had allowed him to help her despite their differences. Maybe survival was about more than just fighting the elements. Maybe it was about finding those moments of connection, of understanding, even when the world around you seemed cold and unwelcoming. "So what now?" James asked, looking around at the vast, empty landscape that stretched out before them. The snow was starting to lighten up, the sun rising higher in the sky, but the world still seemed so vast and daunting. "We walk," Lyra said simply, rising to her feet with a fluid motion that made it seem effortless. "We walk, and we keep going until we find the answers we're looking for." James stood up as well, brushing off the snow that had settled on his gear during the night. As he did, he couldn't help but feel a sense of purpose rising within him. They didn't have all the answers yet, but maybe that was okay. Maybe the journey itself was the answer. And as they began to walk side by side, the mountains looming in the distance, James felt a quiet hope stirring within him. Maybe, for once, it wasn't about controlling the path ahead. Maybe it was just about taking it one step at a time. The journey through the mountains was slow, but steady. The air was crisp, and the cold bit at James' skin, but the rhythm of their footsteps helped keep him grounded. He and Lyra had walked in silence for hours, the snow crunching beneath their boots as they made their way across the rugged terrain. The sun was higher in the sky now, casting long shadows on the snow, but there was still no sign of help. James felt the weight of their situation settling in, but Lyra seemed undeterred. Her calm presence had a way of easing his anxiety, even when the odds felt insurmountable. Every now and then, she would glance at him with that same unreadable expression, as if weighing something in her mind. It was a look that made James feel both exposed and seen at the same time. "Do you ever get tired?" James asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Lyra's pace didn't falter as she answered. "Tired, yes. But that doesn't stop me." Her voice was steady, the words matter-of-fact, as if she had said them 1,000 times before. James was quiet for a moment, contemplating her answer. He wondered if that was the key to her resilience, pushing through, even when exhaustion set in, even when everything seemed to be against you. It wasn't something James had ever had to do in the way Lyra did. His challenges were different, more about facing down enemies or keeping others safe. But this was something else. It was about endurance, about surviving not just physically, but emotionally and mentally as well. James had always been a fighter, but Lyra was showing him what it meant to be something more, a survivor in the truest sense. "How do you do it?" James asked after a moment, his voice barely above a whisper. "How do you keep going?" Lyra turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting his for the briefest of moments. "Because I must," she said simply, her voice carrying a depth of meaning that James couldn't quite grasp. "Because giving up is not an option when survival is everything. James nodded slowly, trying to absorb the weight of her words. He had always thought of survival as a matter of strength and willpower, but there was something deeper in what Lyra was saying. It wasn't about just pushing through. It was about knowing when to lean on others, when to accept help, and when to trust that the journey, no matter how hard, was worth it. You don't have to do it alone, Lyra continued, as if reading his thoughts. I think you're starting to realize that. James wasn't sure if it was a question or a statement, but the truth of her words hit him hard. He had always believed in going it alone, in carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. But Lyra had shown him a different way, one where strength didn't come from isolation, but from the willingness to be vulnerable, to trust someone else when the world felt too heavy. They continued walking in silence, the wind picking up again as the path grew steeper. The further they traveled, the more James felt the toll of the journey in his bones. But it wasn't just the physical exhaustion that weighed on him. It was the mental strain, the uncertainty of what lay ahead. He glanced at Lyra, who walked beside him with that same unshakable calm, and for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe they would make it out of this, together. It wasn't about how far they had come or how much further they had to go. It was about the steps they were taking now, in this moment, and the trust they had begun to build between them. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And for the first time since the storm had hit, James felt a sense of hope stirring inside him, a hope he hadn't realized he'd lost until now. The days stretched on, each one blending into the next as James and Lyra continued their journey through the harsh, snow-covered wilderness. The cold was relentless, and the mountains seemed to press in on them from all sides. But with each step, they grew stronger. There was something about the quiet of the world around them that had begun to settle into James' bones. The silence was no longer oppressive. It had become familiar, even comforting. He found himself looking to Lyra more often, not just for guidance, but for reassurance. She was unshaken by the desolate landscape, her movements fluid and sure as she navigated the rough terrain. Every now and then, she would pause to adjust her gear or check their surroundings, but she never seemed rattled, never seemed afraid. It was as if this kind of hardship was second nature to her. James, on the other hand, had been trained for physical endurance and mental toughness, but this felt different. It was more than just surviving the elements. It was about survival in a world that didn't care whether you lived or died. And yet, in all this uncertainty, there was a strange sense of calm whenever he looked at Lyra. Her presence, the way she moved through the world with such ease, had become a steady anchor for him. "How do you do it?" James asked one evening as they rested by a fire. His voice was hoarse from days of trekking through the cold. Lyra turned to him, her silver eyes glinting in the flickering firelight. "Do what?" she replied, her voice as steady as ever. "Stay so calm," James said, his hands rubbing together for warmth. "You never seem bothered by anything. Not the cold, not the storm, not even the danger." Lyra looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, with a small smile, she replied, "Because worrying about it won't change anything. It only makes the journey harder." James frowned, not fully understanding. "But you have to care, right? Don't you ever feel scared?" Lyra's smile softened, and she shook her head. "Fear is something we all feel," she said quietly. "It's natural, but it's how you handle that fear that matters. You can let it consume you, or you can learn to control it. You don't have to be fearless to survive. You just have to know when to face the fear and when to let it go." James was silent for a moment, turning the words over in his mind. It was a perspective he had never really considered before. He had always thought of fear as something to be conquered, something to push past. But Lyra's words made him realize that maybe there was more to it than just overcoming fear. Maybe it was about understanding it, accepting it, and using it to guide your actions rather than letting it control you. "I think I'm starting to understand," James said after a while, his voice thoughtful. Lyra gave him a nod of approval, her eyes narrowing slightly as she gazed into the fire. "Good," she said simply. "It's not an easy thing to learn, but it's a lesson you can carry with you for the rest of your life." The fire crackled as the wind howled outside, but for the first time in days, James felt a sense of peace settle over him. It wasn't just the warmth from the fire or the exhaustion from the journey. It was something deeper, something inside him that was beginning to shift. They sat in silence for a while longer, each lost in their own thoughts. But James knew that something had changed between them. The bond that had started with a simple act of kindness was growing stronger, and with it, the sense that they could make it through this, together. They were no longer just two strangers in the wilderness. They were partners in survival, each learning from the other, each drawing strength from the other. And as the fire flickered and the night deepened, James realized that this was no longer just about surviving the mountains. It was about surviving the journey, both physically and emotionally, and finding something greater along the way. The days had become a blur as James and Lyra pushed further into the mountains, the snow still deep, the air biting cold. Their pace had slowed, the landscape becoming more treacherous with each passing mile. But there was something different now. James had begun to feel as though he were walking beside someone who understood the weight of every step, the burden of every decision. Lyra, with her quiet strength, had become his anchor, her presence no longer just a comfort but a source of guidance. They walked in a rhythm now, an unspoken understanding passing between them with each step, each glance. Neither of them spoke much, but there was no need. The journey had become a conversation of its own. It was during one of these silences that Lyra spoke, her voice cutting through the stillness like a whisper of the wind. "We're getting closer," she said, her words soft but carrying an undeniable certainty. James looked at her, a flicker of hope stirring in his chest. "How do you know?" he asked, his voice laced with the exhaustion of the days spent in the harsh conditions. Lyra gave him a small, knowing smile. "I can feel it," she said simply. James didn't need to ask her to elaborate. There was something about her, something otherworldly, that made him believe her. Maybe it was her calm in the face of danger, or the way she moved through the world with such confidence, but James trusted her. They had come this far together, and if Lyra said they were close, then he believed her. The mountain pass they were navigating had become steeper, the snow deeper, but Lyra moved with ease, her movements graceful even in the harshest of conditions. James followed her lead, the weight of their journey settling on his shoulders, but his resolve unwavering. They had come this far. They were going to make it. As they rounded a bend in the trail, James caught sight of something in the distance. A faint glimmer of light caught his eye, and his heart skipped a beat. "Do you see that?" he asked, pointing toward the horizon. Lyra turned, her gaze following the line of his finger. "It's not much farther," she said, her voice steady. The light on the horizon grew brighter as they walked, and soon, it became clear what it was. A small outpost, nestled against the side of the mountain, its lights glowing warmly against the stark cold of the surrounding wilderness. James's heart raced as they approached, the sight of civilization a welcome relief. They had made it. Lyra's calm demeanor never wavered, but James could feel the excitement building in his chest. They were going to be okay. The outpost was small, but it was enough. As they drew closer, they could make out the figures of people moving inside, the soft hum of machines in the distance. James felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him, his body finally allowing itself to relax. They had made it. It was hard to believe. The journey had felt endless, but now, it was over, and they were safe. As they approached the outpost, James looked at Lyra, a sense of gratitude overwhelming him. She had been his strength, his guide, his companion through it all. And now, they were finally going to be okay. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Lyra met his gaze, her eyes soft but firm. "You don't have to thank me," she said simply. "We did this together." James smiled, feeling a warmth spread through him that had nothing to do with the fire or the shelter. It was the warmth of something deeper, something he had found in the most unexpected of places. And as they stepped into the outpost, ready to face whatever came next, he knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter for both of them. As they stepped into the warmth of the outpost, James couldn't help but feel a wave of relief wash over him. The cold that had clung to his bones for so long seemed to melt away in the warmth of the building. The bustling activity inside was a stark contrast to the desolation they had just left behind. There were people moving about, their voices a low hum in the background, and the smell of food and hot drinks filled the air. It felt like the first true moment of comfort they had experienced in what seemed like forever. Lyra walked beside him, her posture still as graceful and composed as ever, but James could see a flicker of something different in her eyes. For the first time since he had met her, there was a hint of something like relief, though she was careful to mask it with her usual calm demeanor. As they approached the front desk, a woman with short, dark hair looked up from her work. She froze for a moment, her eyes scanning Lyra and then James, before her expression softened into a welcoming smile. "You two look like you've been through quite a journey," she said, her voice warm. "We have," James replied, his voice still hoarse from the cold. The woman nodded, clearly recognizing the exhaustion in their faces. "I'll get someone to show you to your quarters. You'll need rest after everything you've been through." She motioned for them to follow, leading them down a narrow hallway lined with doors. As they walked, James glanced at Lyra, who seemed to be taking everything in, her eyes scanning their surroundings with the same quiet intensity she always carried. He wanted to ask her how she was feeling, but something told him that she wasn't one to express vulnerability easily. They were both survivors now, but their paths to survival had been so different. The woman led them into a small, cozy room at the end of the hall. It wasn't much, but it was warm, and that was all that mattered. "You're safe here," the woman said, giving them both one last look before turning to leave. "Rest up. We'll take care of the rest." As the door closed behind them, James let out a long breath, feeling his body finally relax. He walked over to the bed and sat down, the exhaustion of the past days catching up to him. His muscles ached, and his mind felt heavy with the weight of everything they had endured. Lyra took a seat across from him, her posture still perfect, but her eyes seemed distant as she stared at the floor. "We made it," James said softly, as if to remind himself that they had, in fact, survived. Lyra met his gaze, her expression unreadable, but there was something in her eyes that James couldn't quite place. "Yes, we did," she replied quietly. There was a pause before she spoke again, her voice almost thoughtful. "But survival is not the end. It is only the beginning." James frowned, unsure of what she meant. "What do you mean?" Lyra's eyes met his, a quiet intensity behind them. "Survival is the first step," she said. "But living, truly living, that's something different." James was silent for a long moment, letting her words sink in. He had thought that surviving the storm, surviving the mountains, was the goal. But Lyra was right. Survival alone wasn't enough. There had to be something more. "I think I understand," he said, his voice low. Lyra gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if she had expected him to understand. For the first time since they had set out, James felt like he was beginning to see the world through her eyes, to understand the quiet wisdom that lay behind her calm exterior. It wasn't just about surviving. It was about finding meaning, finding purpose, even in the hardest of circumstances. As the day drew to a close, the noise of the outpost faded into the background, and James found himself lost in thought. Lyra, still sitting across from him, seemed to be at peace, her eyes closed as she rested. James realized, in that moment, that they had come so far, physically, emotionally, and that maybe, just maybe, they were beginning to find the answers they had been searching for, even if they hadn't realized they were looking for them in the first place. They had made it through the storm, through the wilderness, together. And now, in this quiet, safe space, they could finally begin to rebuild, to move forward, not just as survivors, but as people who had found a way to live again.